Imagine standing in a massive stone arena with the heat of the sun pressing down on your shoulders and the rough sand beneath your feet shifting every time you move. The air is thick with dust, sweat, and the smell of thousands of bodies packed tightly together in towering rows of stone seats. You can hear the noise before you even see the crowd clearly. It begins as a distant rumble and grows into a thunderous roar that vibrates through your chest. Tens of thousands of people are shouting, cheering, chanting, and stomping their feet. The sound rolls across the arena like a storm. Somewhere high above, colorful banners flap in the wind and vendors shout to sell food and wine to excited spectators. This is the center of attention in the ancient Roman Empire, a place where the population gathers to witness spectacle, violence, and drama. And in the middle of it all stands you, a gladiator, holding a weapon that suddenly feels both heavy and terrifyingly important. Across from you stands another man, armed just like you, watching carefully, waiting for the moment the fight begins. Neither of you chose to be here, yet both of you know that once the signal is given, the crowd expects only one thing: a fight worth watching. Movies, paintings, and modern stories often portray gladiators as fearless heroes standing proudly in the arena. Warriors admired by the public and celebrated for their courage. The image is dramatic and powerful. Muscular fighters saluting the crowd, confident champions battling for honor and glory. But the truth behind that image is far darker and far more complicated. In reality, being a gladiator in ancient Rome was rarely glorious. It was dangerous, exhausting, and deeply uncertain, a life controlled by others and shaped by the constant threat of injury or death. To understand why it truly sucked to be a gladiator, you have to look beyond the spectacle and into the daily reality of the men forced to live this life. The arenas of the Roman world were not simply places of entertainment, they were symbols of power and control. When the Roman government organized games, it was not only about pleasing the crowd. It was also about demonstrating the strength and authority of the state. Massive public events showed the wealth of the empire and the ability of its leaders to provide excitement, food, and spectacle for the population. For the people sitting in the stands, the games were thrilling and unforgettable. They could watch trained fighters battle each other with swords, shields, and spears. They could witness exotic animals brought from distant provinces of the empire. They could see dramatic moments of victory, defeat, mercy, and death unfold before their eyes. But for the men standing in the arena sand, the experience was completely different. From their perspective, the cheers of the crowd were not just noise, they were pressure. Every shout demanded a better performance, a more exciting fight, a more dramatic moment. The crowd wanted action, and the gladiators were the ones expected to provide it. Imagine the psychological weight of that moment. You know that thousands of strangers are watching your every move. They are judging your skill, your bravery, even your suffering. Some of them are cheering for you, hoping you win. Others are cheering for your opponent, hoping to see you fall. Many are simply waiting for something dramatic to happen. In that environment, the arena becomes more than just a battlefield. It becomes a stage where survival and entertainment are tangled together in a way that is both brutal and strange. In ancient Roman society, gladiatorial combat was considered one of the most exciting forms of public entertainment. The games could last for days, sometimes even weeks, filled with different types of events designed to keep the crowd engaged. There were animal hunts in the morning, executions around midday, and gladiator fights in the afternoon when the arena was packed with spectators. The events were carefully organized to create excitement and suspense. Music played, announcers introduced the fighters, and the crowd reacted loudly to every moment of action. To the people watching, the games were a thrilling escape from daily life. But for the gladiators themselves, every event was a reminder that their lives were not their own. Many of the men who fought in these arenas had once lived completely different lives. Some were farmers captured during military campaigns. Others were soldiers defeated in battle. Some were criminals punished by being forced into the arena. A few even volunteered, hoping to earn money or fame, though they were a small minority compared to the number of slaves and prisoners. Regardless of how they arrived there, once they entered the gladiatorial system, their future became uncertain. Their bodies were trained for combat, their schedules controlled by their owners, and their survival depended on skill, endurance, and luck. The crowds rarely thought about this side of the story. To them, gladiators were performers. Their struggles were entertainment. Their pain was part of the show. When the crowd shouted, they were not thinking about the fear that might be running through a fighter's mind. They were thinking about excitement. They wanted to see a dramatic clash of weapons, a sudden reversal of fortune, a heroic comeback, or a shocking defeat. In many ways, the arena reflected the values of Roman culture itself. Strength, courage, discipline, and endurance were admired qualities in Roman society. Gladiators, despite their low social status, displayed these qualities in the most visible and intense way possible. A skilled fighter who stood his ground, fought bravely, and showed determination could earn the respect of the audience. Even though he might still be a slave, the crowd might admire his courage. Yet that admiration did not change the reality of his situation. A gladiator could be praised one moment and ordered to fight again the next. His reputation might grow, but his control over his own life remained limited. The arena was also unpredictable. Even the best trained fighters could lose their lives due to a single mistake or an unlucky moment. A slip in the sand, a shield raised too slowly, or a sudden change in an opponent's attack could turn victory into defeat. In such a dangerous environment, the difference between survival and death could be incredibly small. Imagine waking up each day knowing that your profession requires you to risk your life in front of thousands of spectators. Imagine training for hours, preparing your body and mind for combat, while knowing that the next fight could end everything. That was the reality many gladiators faced. Despite the danger, the games continued because they were deeply embedded in Roman culture. Public spectacles had existed in Rome for centuries, and gladiatorial combat became one of the most popular forms of entertainment. Wealthy politicians and emperors organized games to gain public support and display their generosity. Hosting large events made leaders look powerful and generous in the eyes of the population. The bigger the spectacle, the more impressive the host appeared. That meant more fighters, more animals, and more dramatic battles in the arena. The crowds loved it. They cheered, argued, placed bets, and celebrated their favorite fighters. But the gladiators themselves lived in a completely different reality from the one experienced by the audience. When the gates opened and a fighter stepped into the arena, he carried more than just weapons and armor. He carried the weight of expectation, fear, and survival. Every step forward meant entering a place where the outcome could never be guaranteed. In that moment, the noise of the crowd might fade slightly as the fighter focused on his opponent. The sand underfoot, the grip of the weapon, the position of the shield, the distance between bodies, these details suddenly mattered more than anything else. Because once the fight began, everything depended on them. For the spectators sitting high above, it was an exciting afternoon of entertainment. For the gladiators standing below, it was something very different. It was a test of skill, endurance, and luck played out in the harshest possible conditions. It was a place where courage was necessary but not always enough. And as the roar of the crowd echoed through the stone walls of the arena somewhere in the heart of the Roman Empire, one truth remained clear for the men holding weapons in the sand. In that world of spectacle and violence centered in places like Rome, being a gladiator was far less heroic than the legends would later suggest. It was dangerous, exhausting, uncertain, and often terrifying, a life where survival depended not only on strength and training, but also on the unpredictable desires of a crowd that demanded entertainment above all else. One of the biggest misconceptions about gladiators is the belief that they willingly chose the life of arena fighters, stepping forward in search of fame, glory, and applause from thousands of spectators. Modern movies and stories often portray gladiators as proud warriors who volunteered for combat, driven by ambition or the desire to prove themselves. The reality in the ancient Roman Empire was very different. For the vast majority of gladiators, the arena was not a place they chose to enter. It was a place they were forced into, often after losing everything they once had. Many gladiators began their journey not as fighters, but as ordinary people whose lives were suddenly turned upside down by war, conquest, punishment, or desperate circumstances. When the armies of Rome expanded across Europe, North Africa, and parts of Asia, they did more than just claim land. They captured enormous numbers of prisoners. These prisoners of war could include soldiers who had fought against Roman forces, villagers caught in the path of military campaigns, and civilians from defeated regions who were taken as part of the spoils of conquest. For Rome, war was not only about territory and power, it was also about resources, and human beings were considered one of those resources. Captives were often marched long distances, chained together, exhausted and frightened, toward markets where they would be sold as slaves. Some were sent to farms to work the land, others were assigned to construction projects, mines, or households. But a certain number of these captives ended up in a much more dangerous place, gladiator training schools known as ludi. Once someone was sold to a gladiator school, their life changed instantly and permanently. They were no longer simply a slave performing labor. They were now an investment in a brutal entertainment industry. Their new owners expected them to train, fight, and risk their lives in public spectacles that entertained massive crowds. From that moment on, their future was tied to the arena. The experience of being captured and forced into this system was terrifying. Imagine being taken from your homeland, separated from your family, stripped of your freedom, and transported to a foreign city where you did not even understand the language. Everything familiar was gone. In its place stood walls, guards, weapons, and the constant reminder that your survival now depended on learning how to fight. Some captives might have once been farmers who had never held a sword in their lives. Others might have been soldiers who had fought bravely in battle but were defeated and captured. Regardless of their past, they were now treated as property within the Roman system. Their value was determined not by their personality, dreams, or history, but by how well they could perform in combat. Criminals also found themselves forced into gladiatorial combat. In Roman law, certain crimes could be punished with condemnation to the arena. This sentence was known as damnatio ad ludum or damnatio ad gladiatorium, meaning the condemned person was forced to fight as a gladiator. For these individuals, the arena served as both punishment and spectacle. The public could watch criminals suffer and struggle, turning justice into entertainment. These condemned fighters often had even worse prospects than regular gladiators because they might receive less training and fewer opportunities to survive. For them, the arena could become a place of near certain death. Yet even though most gladiators were slaves or prisoners, there was another small and surprising group: volunteers. These men were known as *octorati*. Unlike slaves, they technically chose to enter the gladiatorial system. However, their choice was rarely motivated by dreams of glory alone. Many volunteers were men drowning in debt or facing extreme poverty. Roman society could be harsh for those who lost their financial stability. A man who owed large sums of money might see his reputation destroyed, his property seized, and his future disappear. For some of these desperate individuals, selling themselves to a gladiator school seemed like the only way to survive. By signing a contract with a gladiator trainer, they could receive money, food, and a place to live. But in return, they had to accept the same risks and punishments as slave gladiators. They essentially gave up many of their legal rights and placed their bodies under the control of the lanista, the owner of the gladiator school. Even though they entered the system voluntarily, their lives soon resembled those of slaves in many ways. Once a person became part of a gladiator school, daily life was tightly controlled. The ludi functioned like strict training compounds surrounded by high walls and guarded entrances. The men inside were not free to leave. Their movements were monitored, their schedules organized, and their behavior regulated by the trainers and guards who supervised them. Food, sleep, and exercise were carefully managed because the gladiators were valuable assets. Training fighters cost money, and losing them too quickly could be expensive. As a result, the gladiators were sometimes treated better than other slaves in terms of diet and medical attention. They were often fed high-energy meals designed to build strength and endurance. Ancient sources even suggest that gladiators were sometimes nicknamed barley men because barley was a major part of their diet. But better food did not mean a better life. The underlying truth remained the same. They were prisoners within a system designed to profit from their combat. When the gates of the training school closed each evening, the men inside knew they were trapped in a world built around violence. The psychological adjustment must have been immense. Imagine being taken from a normal life, whether as a farmer, a soldier, or a citizen, and suddenly finding yourself in a place where the main goal was to become a professional fighter. You would be surrounded by other men in the same situation, each with his own story of loss and hardship. Some might speak different languages, coming from distant regions conquered by Roman armies. Others might carry scars from previous battles or punishments. The training grounds would echo with the sounds of wooden swords striking, shields, instructors shouting orders, and fighters struggling to master new techniques. Day after day, the routine would repeat: training, exercise, discipline, and preparation for the moment when the arena doors would open. In the gladiator schools connected to cities like Rome, this preparation was taken extremely seriously because the reputation of a school depended on the performance of its fighters. A skilled gladiator who fought well could attract attention, admiration, and betting from the audience. That meant more profit for the owner of the school, but it also meant more pressure on the fighter himself. Every match became an opportunity to prove worth or to fail in front of thousands of spectators. Over time, some gladiators developed strong bonds with their fellow trainees. Living together under such intense circumstances created a kind of brotherhood among many fighters. They trained together, ate together, and shared the same fears about future battles. Yet that bond carried a tragic irony. In some cases, these same men might later face each other in the arena as opponents. The system did not care about friendship or loyalty. What mattered was creating a dramatic and entertaining fight. So a man might be forced to stand in the sand and raise his weapon against someone he had trained beside for months or even years. The emotional weight of that moment must have been enormous. All around the Roman world, the popularity of gladiatorial games ensured a constant demand for fighters. Cities competed to host impressive spectacles, and wealthy patrons sponsored games to gain public favor. This demand meant that gladiator schools always needed new recruits. War captives, condemned criminals, and desperate volunteers continued to flow into the system, feeding the cycle of training and combat. For the spectators sitting high in the stone seats of an amphitheater, the fighters below were simply characters in a thrilling show. Each gladiator had a distinct fighting style, armor type, and weapon set that made the battles more interesting to watch. But the audience rarely thought about the human stories behind those fighters. They did not see the villages destroyed in distant provinces, the families separated by conquest, or the desperate decisions that led some men to sign contracts with gladiator trainers. They saw helmets shining in the sunlight, shields raised for battle, and the excitement of a dramatic contest about to begin. The arena transformed real human suffering into a spectacle that felt almost like theater, and once the fight began, the crowd focused entirely on the action. In that moment, the long journey that had brought a gladiator into the arena, whether through war, punishment, or poverty, faded into the background. What mattered was the clash of weapons, the skill of the fighters, and the suspense of the outcome. But if you stepped away from the cheering stands and looked at the situation from the perspective of the fighters themselves, the picture changed completely. For them, the arena represented the final stage of a process that had begun with loss of freedom. It was the place where their forced transformation into gladiators reached its most dangerous moment. They were no longer farmers, soldiers, craftsmen, or citizens. They were performers in a system built around combat and survival. And in the world of the ancient Roman Empire, where public spectacles in cities like Rome drew massive crowds eager for excitement, that system ensured one harsh truth for the men inside it. Most gladiators had never wanted this life at all, yet they were forced to live it every single day. Once a man became part of a gladiator school, his life changed completely. The outside world, with its familiar places, family members, and sense of freedom, was suddenly replaced by high walls, guarded gates, strict routines, and the constant expectation of violence. Gladiator schools, known as ludi, were not casual training camps or athletic academies. They were controlled environments designed to turn human beings into professional fighters capable of surviving brutal combat in the arena. For many men brought into these schools in the vast territories of the Roman Empire, the experience felt less like entering a school and more like entering a prison where every aspect of life revolved around preparing for deadly battles. The men who owned and operated these schools were called lanisti. A lanista was both a businessman and a trainer, someone who purchased slaves or accepted volunteers and transformed them into gladiators who could be rented out to organizers of public games. To the lanista, each gladiator represented an investment. Training a fighter required food, equipment, space, and time, and a skilled gladiator who survived several matches could earn large profits for the school. Because of this, lanisti wanted their fighters to be strong, disciplined, and capable in combat. But they also understood that the men under their control were dangerous. Gladiators were trained killers, and many of them had every reason to hate the system that trapped them. As a result, security inside a gladiator school was strict. The buildings were designed to prevent escape, often surrounded by thick walls and guarded entrances. The fighters lived in small cells or rooms arranged around a central courtyard where training took place. Guards watched the gates, and the routines of the day were tightly controlled. From the moment the sun rose until late in the evening, the lives of the gladiators followed a structured schedule that left little room for freedom or personal choice. Training formed the core of daily life. The goal of this training was not simply to make the fighters strong, but to prepare them for the specific styles of combat they would perform in the arena. Gladiators were not all the same. Different types of gladiators used different weapons, armor, and techniques. Some carried large shields and short swords, while others used nets and tridents, curved blades, or spears. The trainers in the school studied these fighting styles carefully and assigned each gladiator to a particular role. This specialization made the battles in the arena more exciting for the audience because different fighting styles created dramatic contrasts. But for the gladiators themselves, it meant long hours learning the precise movements required by their assigned role. Practice began early. Fighters would enter the training yard, often a sandy courtyard surrounded by the cells where they slept. Instructors, sometimes former gladiators who had survived their careers, demonstrated techniques and corrected mistakes. At first, the weapons used in training were usually made of wood rather than metal. These wooden swords and shields were often heavier than the real equipment used in the arena. The extra weight forced the gladiators to build strength and endurance. Swinging a heavy wooden sword again and again under the hot sun was exhausting work. Every movement required effort, and the repetitive drills pushed muscles to their limits. Yet the purpose behind this harsh method was simple. When the time came to fight with real weapons, the lighter equipment would feel easier to control. The training sessions could last for hours. Gladiators practiced striking, blocking, stepping forward, stepping back, and maintaining balance in the sand. Footwork was just as important as strength. A single misstep could expose a fighter to an attack. Trainers constantly shouted instructions, demanding discipline and precision. Mistakes were corrected immediately, sometimes with harsh punishment. Discipline inside the school was strict because the lanista expected results. If a gladiator disobeyed orders, fought carelessly, or tried to escape, the consequences could be severe. Punishments might include beatings, chains, or other forms of harsh treatment designed to reinforce control. The message was clear: the lanista owned the gladiators, and their survival depended on following the rules. Despite the harsh discipline, the training environment was strangely complex. On one hand, the gladiators were treated as property and forced into dangerous work. On the other hand, they were valuable assets whose health and strength mattered to their owners. This meant that gladiators often received better food than many other slaves in Roman society. Their diet was carefully planned to build stamina and muscle. Ancient sources describe meals that included barley, beans, vegetables, and sometimes meat. This diet provided energy for the intense training sessions and helped maintain the fighters' physical condition. Medical care was also more advanced than one might expect. Some gladiator schools employed physicians who specialized in treating injuries common among fighters. Cuts, bruises, sprains, and broken bones were frequent during training. A skilled doctor could patch up wounds, set bones, and help a fighter recover so he could continue training. In cities like Rome, where large gladiator schools supplied fighters to major arenas, maintaining the health of gladiators was an important part of the business. Yet even with better food and medical attention, life inside the school remained mentally exhausting. Every gladiator understood the ultimate purpose of the training. They were not preparing for sport or friendly competition. They were preparing to fight in front of thousands of spectators where injuries and death were real possibilities. The constant awareness of this future created a unique psychological atmosphere. Some men became fiercely determined to master their fighting style, believing that skill could improve their chances of survival. Others struggled with fear, anger, or hopelessness as they realized how little control they had over their fate. The social environment inside the school added another layer to the experience. Gladiators lived, trained, and ate together. Over time, many formed friendships or bonds with one another. Sharing the same hardships created a sense of brotherhood among the fighters. They understood each other's fears and frustrations in ways that outsiders could never fully grasp. Conversations in the evenings might include stories about their past lives, memories of distant homes, or quiet discussions about the upcoming games. These relationships could provide emotional support in a world filled with uncertainty. But the bond between gladiators carried a tragic reality. The same men who trained side by side might eventually face each other as opponents in the arena. The lanista and the organizers of the games decided who fought whom, and the decisions were based on entertainment value rather than personal relationships. A gladiator might find himself standing in the arena across from someone he had practiced with for months. In that moment, friendship had to disappear, replaced by the brutal necessity of survival. The training grounds prepared them for this reality by emphasizing discipline and emotional control. Fighters were taught to focus on technique and strategy rather than personal feelings. Another challenge inside the gladiator school was the constant presence of competition. Gladiators knew that their performance in training affected their chances of being selected for important matches. A skilled fighter might be chosen to participate in major games held in large arenas, events that attracted huge crowds and wealthy sponsors. These matches could bring recognition and possibly improve a gladiator's reputation. But they also carried greater risk because stronger opponents were often involved. Less skilled fighters might be used in smaller events or placed in more dangerous situations where survival was less likely. This created a competitive atmosphere in which every gladiator had to prove his worth. Escape was always on the minds of some fighters, but attempting it was incredibly dangerous. Gladiator schools were built specifically to prevent such attempts. Guards monitored the gates, and the fighters were rarely allowed outside the walls without supervision. Any escape attempt would likely be met with severe punishment, both for the person attempting to flee and possibly for others in the school as well. The threat of collective punishment sometimes discouraged escape plans, creating tension among the fighters themselves. Despite these restrictions, the idea of freedom never completely disappeared. Stories circulated about rare individuals who managed to earn their release after years of successful fighting. The possibility, however distant, gave some gladiators a reason to keep training and surviving. Every day inside the school was therefore filled with conflicting emotions. Exhaustion from training, fear of the future, loyalty to fellow fighters, resentment toward the system, and a faint hope that survival might eventually lead to freedom. The physical environment reinforced these emotions. The walls of the school separated the gladiators from the rest of society, creating a closed world focused entirely on combat preparation. Outside those walls, ordinary life continued in the cities of the Roman Empire. Markets bustled, families gathered for meals, and citizens went about their daily routines. Inside the school, however, everything revolved around training, discipline, and the looming presence of the arena. The sand of the training yard became as familiar to the fighters as the floors of their sleeping cells. The sound of wooden swords striking shields echoed through the courtyard day after day, reminding everyone why they were there. Over time, the training shaped the bodies and minds of the gladiators. Muscles grew stronger, movements became more precise, and reflexes sharpened. A man who had once been a farmer or craftsman slowly transformed into a professional fighter. Yet that transformation came at a heavy cost. The process required constant effort, strict obedience, and acceptance of a life defined by violence. By the time a gladiator was ready to step into the arena, he had already endured months or even years of preparation inside the walls of the gladiator school. He had learned the techniques of combat, the discipline required to survive, and the harsh reality that his life now belonged to a system designed for public spectacle. And when the day finally arrived for him to leave the training yard and enter the arena before thousands of spectators in cities like Rome, all the hours of brutal training inside the school would face their ultimate test. Eventually the day arrived when training was no longer enough, and the gladiator had to face the reality he had been preparing for since the moment he entered the school. Training yards, wooden weapons, and practice drills were only the beginning. The true test waited beyond the walls of the gladiator school in the arenas, where thousands of spectators gathered to watch combat unfold in front of their eyes. For many fighters in the vast territories of the Roman Empire, the arena represented both the center of attention and the place where their lives could change forever in a single moment. The journey from the training compound to the arena itself was often filled with tension. Gladiators might be transported through busy streets where ordinary citizens paused to watch them pass. Some people stared with curiosity, others with admiration, and some with the excitement of knowing they would soon see these men fighting in the games. To the crowd, the gladiators were performers in a grand spectacle. To the fighters themselves, the journey felt more like being escorted toward a dangerous stage where survival was uncertain. When they finally arrived at the amphitheater, the scale of the structure alone could be overwhelming. The most famous example of such a place was the Colosseum, a massive stone arena capable of holding tens of thousands of spectators. Towering walls rose above the sand floor, lined with rows upon rows of seating that stretched upward in great arcs. Each level of seats was filled with people from different parts of Roman society. The most important officials and wealthy citizens sat close to the arena floor where they could see the action clearly. Higher up sat ordinary citizens, soldiers, merchants, and travelers who had come to witness the spectacle. The noise of such a crowd could be enormous. As people entered the amphitheater, they talked, laughed, shouted, and argued about which fighters they expected to win. Vendors walked through the rows selling food and drinks while children leaned over the railings to look at the sandy arena below. Music sometimes played as part of the opening ceremonies, adding to the sense that this was not just a fight but a carefully organized public event. For the gladiators waiting behind the gates, or in underground chambers beneath the arena, the sounds of the crowd drifted down like distant thunder. The roar of thousands of voices could make even the most experienced fighter feel the weight of the moment. Before the fights began, there were often ceremonies meant to build excitement. Gladiators might be introduced to the audience, walking in formation across the arena floor while spectators watched closely. Their armor and weapons reflected the sunlight, and their different fighting styles could be recognized by those familiar with the games. Some gladiators carried large rectangular shields and short swords, while others held curved blades or unusual weapons designed to create dramatic battles. Each type of gladiator had its own distinctive appearance, which made the upcoming fights easier for the audience to follow. After the introductions, the fighters returned to their waiting areas while other events took place. Gladiatorial games were rarely just a series of one-on-one fights. They were full-day spectacles filled with different forms of entertainment. In the morning there might be animal hunts, where trained hunters fought exotic animals brought from distant regions of the empire. Lions, leopards, bears, and other creatures were displayed before the crowd, creating excitement and danger at the same time. Later in the day there could be public executions where criminals were punished in dramatic ways. Only after these earlier events did the main gladiator battles begin, often in the afternoon when the arena was at its fullest and the crowd most eager for action. When the moment finally arrived, the gates opened and the gladiators stepped into the arena. The sand under their feet was carefully prepared to absorb blood and provide traction during combat. The heat of the sun often beat down on the fighters, reflecting off the stone walls and armor. All around them rose the towering structure of the amphitheater filled with faces watching their every movement. From the perspective of the crowd, the fighters below might have seemed small against the vast scale of the arena. But for the gladiators themselves, the space felt intensely personal. Every movement mattered. Every step, every shift of the shield, every glance toward the opponent could determine the outcome of the fight. The beginning of the battle was often cautious. Gladiators studied each other carefully, looking for weaknesses or signs of hesitation. Their training had taught them to move with precision and patience rather than rushing blindly into danger. Shields were raised, weapons held ready, and the fighters circled each other in the sand, while the crowd watched in anticipation. The tension in these moments could be enormous because everyone knew that the first successful strike might change everything. The types of battles varied widely. Some matches paired fighters with contrasting equipment so that their strengths and weaknesses created an exciting contest. One gladiator might carry heavy armor and a large shield, making him well protected but slower to move. His opponent might wear lighter gear and rely on speed and agility to avoid attacks. Another famous style involved a fighter armed with a net and trident facing an opponent with a sword and shield. The unusual combination of weapons created a dramatic struggle between distance and close combat. Each type of battle was designed to keep the audience engaged while challenging the fighters in different ways. As the fight progressed, the calm tension of the opening moments often gave way to sudden bursts of action. Weapons clashed against shields, sparks flew from metal striking metal, and the fighters moved quickly across the sand trying to gain the advantage. The crowd reacted loudly to every near miss, every successful block, and every strike that landed. A well-timed move might draw cheers from one side of the arena, while supporters of the other fighter shouted encouragement in response. For the gladiators themselves, however, the noise could fade into the background as they focused entirely on the struggle in front of them. Survival required concentration. A single mistake could be fatal. Even experienced fighters who had survived multiple matches understood how unpredictable the arena could be. The sand might shift underfoot at the wrong moment, sweat might blur vision. An opponent might suddenly change tactics and launch an unexpected attack. The training inside the gladiator school prepared them for these possibilities, but preparation could never remove the element of danger completely. Injuries were common during these battles. Cuts from blades, bruises from heavy blows, and broken bones from powerful strikes could occur in seconds. The armor worn by gladiators offered some protection, but it was often designed to leave parts of the body exposed to create more dramatic fights. This design increased the risk of wounds while still allowing the fighters enough mobility to perform their roles effectively. Blood sometimes stained the sand as battles grew more intense, and the sight of injury often drove the crowd to even greater excitement. Yet despite the violence, not every fight ended in death. Contrary to some modern myths, Many gladiator matches were intended to test skill rather than simply produce fatalities. Training a gladiator required time and money, and owners did not always want their fighters killed unnecessarily. If a gladiator was wounded or clearly defeated, he might drop his weapon and raise a hand to signal surrender. At that moment, the attention of the crowd shifted to the decision about what would happen next. Spectators sometimes shouted their opinions, urging mercy or demanding death depending on their mood and the performance they had just witnessed. The final decision often rested with the organizer of the games or an official present at the event. For the defeated gladiator kneeling in the sand, those moments could feel endless. Injured and exhausted, he waited to learn whether he would live to fight another day or die in front of the thousands watching him. If mercy was granted, attendants would enter the arena to help him leave and receive medical care. If not, the victor might be ordered to deliver the final blow. These dramatic endings were part of what made the games so gripping to Roman audiences. The arena was not only a place of combat but also a stage where the themes of courage, fate, and authority played out in front of the public. Emperors and political leaders sometimes attended the games, using the opportunity to display their power and generosity. By hosting large spectacles in cities like Rome, they demonstrated their ability to provide entertainment and maintain order within society. The crowd's reaction to the events in the arena could even influence public opinion about those leaders. A generous ruler who allowed mercy to defeated fighters might earn admiration, while a harsh decision could provoke murmurs among the spectators. For the gladiators themselves, however, these political and cultural meanings were secondary to the immediate reality of survival. Each time they stepped into the arena, they faced the possibility that the fight could be their last. The cheers of the crowd, the towering walls of the amphitheater, and the bright sunlight on the sand all formed the backdrop to a struggle that was intensely personal. Victory might bring temporary safety, perhaps even admiration from the audience. Defeat might bring injury, humiliation, or death. In this world of spectacle and danger that flourished throughout the Roman Empire, the arena stood as the ultimate proving ground for the men trained in the gladiator schools. It was the place where months or years of preparation were tested under the gaze of thousands, where skill and courage met the unpredictable forces of chance, and where every clash of weapons reminded the fighters that their lives had become part of a brutal entertainment system that demanded drama, excitement, and above all, a fight worth watching. Even when a gladiator survived the chaos of the arena and walked away from a fight alive, the struggle was far from over. Survival in one match did not guarantee safety in the future, and the physical toll of repeated combat slowly accumulated on the bodies of the fighters. The arena might last only minutes during a single battle, but the consequences of those moments could last for the rest of a gladiator's life. In the violent entertainment culture of the Roman Empire, the audience saw the excitement of battle, the clash of steel, and the dramatic moment of victory or defeat. What they rarely saw was what happened afterward to the men who had fought in the sand. Behind the spectacle was a world filled with wounds, exhaustion, and the constant pressure to recover quickly so that the cycle of training and fighting could begin again. The body of a gladiator was his most important tool, but it was also constantly under attack. Even skilled fighters who managed to avoid fatal blows often left the arena with injuries. Deep cuts from blades were common, especially when a shield slipped or an opponent found an opening in the armor. These wounds might slice through skin and muscle, leaving scars that would remain for the rest of the fighter's life. Bruises and fractures were also frequent because the weapons used in gladiatorial combat were heavy and designed to deliver powerful strikes. A well-placed blow from a sword, shield, or spear could crack bones or leave a fighter unable to stand without pain. Some injuries were immediately obvious, while others developed slowly after the adrenaline of battle faded. When the fight ended and the gladiator returned to the training compound, the reality of the damage often became clear. Medical treatment existed, but it was limited by the knowledge and technology of the time. In large cities such as Rome, gladiator schools sometimes employed physicians who specialized in treating fighters because injuries were such a regular part of their profession. These doctors cleaned wounds, applied bandages, stitched cuts when possible, and set broken bones. They also used herbal remedies and ointments believed to reduce infection or pain. Compared to the medical care available to many ordinary people in the ancient world, gladiators sometimes received surprisingly attentive treatment because their survival had economic value to their owners. Yet even with medical attention, recovery could be slow and uncertain. Infection was one of the greatest dangers. Without modern antibiotics or sterilization techniques, a wound that seemed manageable could become life-threatening within days. Dirt from the arena, sand, sweat, and bacteria could enter open cuts, causing swelling, fever, and severe illness. A gladiator who had survived a fierce battle might find himself fighting for his life again, this time against an invisible enemy spreading through his body. Many scars carried by surviving gladiators were reminders not only of their opponents' blades, but also of the long healing process that followed each fight. The constant presence of injury shaped the daily routine inside gladiator schools. Fighters returning from the arena were given time to recover, but they also knew that their rest would not last forever. Once their wounds healed enough to allow movement, training began again. Muscles stiff from injury had to be stretched and strengthened. Techniques had to be practiced repeatedly so that the fighter would not lose his skill. The cycle of preparation never truly ended because the next match could always be scheduled. This created a life in which pain was almost normal. Many gladiators learned to fight while carrying old injuries that had never completely healed. A scar across the arm might limit movement. A previously broken rib might ache during heavy exertion. A damaged knee might make quick steps difficult in the shifting sand of the arena. Each injury became part of the fighter's personal history, a physical record of the battles he had survived. Over time, the bodies of experienced gladiators often became covered with marks from earlier fights. Scars crossed their shoulders, arms, legs, and torsos, each one telling a story about a moment when survival had hung in the balance. Despite these hardships, some gladiators gained popularity among the spectators who filled the amphitheaters. Roman audiences admired courage, skill, and dramatic performances in the arena. A fighter who consistently displayed bravery and competence could develop a reputation that spread across the city. People might recognize his name when it was announced before a match. Some fans even supported particular gladiators in the same way modern sports fans support athletes or teams. Graffiti found in ancient cities sometimes recorded the victories of famous fighters, praising their strength or predicting their success in future games. This admiration created the strange situation in which a man who was technically a slave could also become a public figure admired by thousands. Yet fame did not erase the reality of his situation. A gladiator's popularity belonged largely to the crowd, not to the fighter himself. The cheers of spectators might follow him into the arena, but they did not give him control over his own life. He remained under the authority of the lanista, who owned his contract or his body. That owner decided when he fought, where he fought, and against whom. A popular gladiator might be rented out for prestigious games where the stakes were higher and the crowds larger. While this might increase his reputation, it also meant facing stronger opponents and risking more serious injuries. Fame therefore carried its own kind of danger because it placed the fighter in situations where the audience expected especially dramatic battles. The public admiration of gladiators also revealed a contradiction in Roman society. On one hand, gladiators were technically considered infames, people with low social status who had little respect in the legal structure of society. On the other hand, their courage in the arena could inspire fascination and admiration from the same public that considered them socially inferior. Citizens who would never want to live the life of a gladiator still admired the bravery required to face death so directly. The arena transformed these men into symbols of endurance and skill, even though their personal freedom remained extremely limited. For the gladiators themselves, the applause of the crowd might bring a brief sense of pride, but it could not erase the harsh conditions of their existence. Every victory in the arena carried the knowledge that another fight would eventually follow. The body might heal from one wound only to receive another in the next battle. The cheers of the audience faded quickly once the games ended, and the fighters returned to the training compound where the cycle of preparation began again. The possibility of freedom existed, but it was distant and uncertain. In Roman gladiatorial culture, a fighter who achieved exceptional success over many matches might eventually earn his release. The symbol of this freedom was the rudis, a wooden sword presented to a gladiator who had proven himself worthy of retirement from the arena. Receiving the rudis meant that the fighter was no longer required to participate in gladiatorial combat. For many men trapped in the system, this possibility represented the ultimate goal. Yet reaching that moment required surviving years of dangerous battles. Many gladiators never lived long enough to achieve it. Some died in the arena after only a few matches. Others survived several fights but eventually suffered injuries too severe to overcome. Even those who survived for a long time might find their bodies permanently damaged by the constant strain of combat. The dream of freedom therefore existed alongside the knowledge that it might never be realized. Within the gladiator schools and arenas of the Roman Empire, the story of a successful fighter who earned the rudes was inspiring but also rare. Most gladiators remained part of the system until their bodies could no longer endure the punishment, or until they met their end in the sand before the watching crowd. For the spectators filling amphitheaters in cities such as Rome, the excitement of the games often overshadowed these realities. They saw the dramatic moments of battle, the thrilling victories, and the occasional act of mercy granted to a defeated fighter. They did not always see the long recovery periods, the lingering pain of old wounds, or the quiet struggles of men who had survived but carried the scars of every fight with them. Behind every cheer from the crowd stood a fighter whose body bore the evidence of the life he was forced to live, a life where survival meant enduring injury after injury while continuing to step back into the arena because there was no other choice. Even when a gladiator became popular with the crowd, his life rarely became easier. Fame inside the arena could bring cheers, recognition, and sometimes even admiration from thousands of spectators, but it did not remove the chains of the system that controlled him. In the society of the Roman Empire, a gladiator's reputation belonged mostly to the audience, not to the fighter himself. The cheers of the crowd might echo across the arena when he entered the sand. But once the games ended, he still returned to the same training compound, the same strict routines, and the same uncertain future. For the spectators sitting high in the stands, gladiators often seemed larger than life. Their victories were discussed in markets and public squares, and their names might even appear scratched into walls as graffiti praising their skill or predicting their next triumph. Some fans followed particular fighters closely, celebrating their successes and hoping to see them win again in future games. This admiration created a strange contrast between the gladiator's public image and his private reality. To the crowd he might appear as a fearless champion, but behind the scenes he remained a man living under strict control, expected to risk his life whenever the games required it. Popular gladiators sometimes received better treatment than others because their success made them valuable to the owners of gladiator schools. A fighter who consistently entertained the crowd could attract attention from wealthy sponsors who organized games. The more exciting the fighter's reputation became, the more likely he was to be invited to participate in important spectacles. This could lead to appearances in large arenas where enormous crowds gathered, including those in cities like Rome. Fighting in such places brought greater fame, but it also increased the danger. High-profile games often matched skilled fighters against equally dangerous opponents, creating battles designed to impress the audience. The stakes were higher, and the expectations from the crowd were greater. Every move inside the arena carried the pressure of living up to that reputation. The crowd expected dramatic action, not cautious survival. If a famous gladiator entered the arena, people wanted to see a memorable fight. They wanted powerful strikes, clever tactics, and moments that would keep them talking long after the games ended. For the fighter, this expectation could become a heavy burden. He knew that a quiet or cautious performance might disappoint the audience, but reckless aggression could expose him to deadly attacks. Balancing entertainment and survival became part of the challenge of life in the arena. Another strange part of gladiator fame was the admiration some spectators felt toward the fighters themselves. Roman culture valued courage, endurance, and discipline, qualities that gladiators displayed in the most dramatic way possible. Even though gladiators were often slaves or criminals in the eyes of the law, their bravery in combat could still earn respect from the crowd. Some wealthy citizens even collected memorabilia connected to their favorite fighters, such as small souvenirs or inscriptions celebrating victories. Stories about particularly skilled gladiators spread across cities, turning them into legends during their lifetimes. Yet this admiration had clear limits. The same crowd that cheered loudly for a victorious gladiator could also demand his death if he failed in the arena. Public opinion was unpredictable, and the excitement of the spectacle sometimes mattered more to spectators than the fate of the men fighting below them. A gladiator might win the admiration of thousands one day and face a deadly opponent the next, with no guarantee that the crowd's support would save him. Fame, therefore, offered recognition but not safety. The gladiator remained part of a system where his survival depended on skill, endurance, and luck, rather than popularity alone. Inside the gladiator schools, this reality was well understood. Trainers reminded fighters that admiration from the crowd could disappear quickly if they became careless or weak. A reputation for bravery might encourage the audience to cheer, but it would not stop a blade from cutting or a spear from striking. Gladiators had to remain focused on their training and discipline because the arena did not forgive mistakes. Each fight began with the same basic truth. No matter how famous a gladiator had become, he still had to face another opponent determined to survive. The possibility of freedom existed for those who achieved extraordinary success over many battles. A gladiator who survived long enough and fought impressively might eventually earn release from the arena. This reward, symbolized by the presentation of a wooden sword known as the rudes, represented the end of a gladiator's compulsory service. Receiving the rudes meant that the fighter was finally free to leave the life of constant combat behind. For many gladiators, this moment became the ultimate dream. Yet the path toward that freedom was extremely difficult. Surviving years of combat in the arenas of the Roman Empire required extraordinary resilience. Many fighters never reached that point. Some died early in their careers, while others suffered injuries that ended their ability to fight long before they could earn their release. Even those who eventually gained freedom often carried the physical and emotional scars of their years in the arena. Their bodies bore marks from countless battles, and their memories held the echoes of cheering crowds and flashing weapons. For these men, the experience of being a gladiator never truly disappeared. Fame in the arena might fade over time, but the memories of the fights, the injuries, and the constant struggle for survival remain part of their lives forever. For every gladiator who stepped into the arena, there was always one shadow that followed closely behind: the constant presence of death. No matter how skilled, experienced, or popular a fighter became, the risk never truly disappeared. Each battle carried the possibility that it could be the last. In the public spectacles that captivated audiences throughout the Roman Empire, the excitement of the crowd depended partly on this uncertainty. Spectators understood that the fights they watched were not carefully controlled games where every participant would walk away unharmed. Real danger was involved, and that danger made the spectacle feel thrilling and dramatic. But for the men standing in the arena sand, the knowledge that death could arrive at any moment created a psychological burden that few people in the audience could fully understand. The experience of entering the arena required immense mental strength. Long before the fight began, a gladiator already carried the awareness that his life might end that day. As he waited behind the gates or in the underground chambers beneath the amphitheater, he could hear the distant roar of the crowd gathering above. Each shout, cheer, and echoing footstep reminded him that thousands of eyes would soon be watching his struggle for survival. In cities like Rome, where enormous arenas drew massive audiences eager for entertainment, the pressure on the fighters could be overwhelming. They were not simply competing against an opponent. They were performing before an entire society that expected drama, courage, and spectacle. When the gates opened and the gladiators stepped into the sunlight, the scale of the moment became impossible to ignore. The towering walls of the amphitheater surrounded the arena, and the faces of spectators filled every row of seats. The crowd's noise rose and fell like waves, reacting to each movement of the fighters. For the audience, this was thrilling entertainment. For the gladiators, it was the moment when months or years of training faced their ultimate test. Every step in the sand, every swing of a weapon, every attempt to block an incoming strike carried the possibility of life or death. A fighter could train for years and still lose everything because of one mistake. A moment of hesitation, a slip of the foot, or a missed opportunity could allow an opponent to land a fatal blow. The unpredictability of combat meant that even the most experienced gladiator could fall unexpectedly. This constant risk created a unique psychological environment inside the gladiatorial world. Fighters had to learn to control their fear while still respecting the danger they faced. Too much fear could slow reactions and lead to defeat. Too little caution could lead to reckless mistakes. Balancing courage and caution was part of the mental discipline that gladiators developed during their training. They learned to focus intensely on the movements of their opponent, to anticipate attacks, and to remain calm even as weapons flashed dangerously close to their bodies. Yet even with strong discipline, the awareness of death never completely vanished. It lingered in the background of every match, reminding the fighters that survival was never guaranteed. The final moments of a battle could be especially intense. When one gladiator gained the upper hand and his opponent was wounded or disarmed, the fight often reached a dramatic pause. The defeated fighter might drop his weapon, kneel, or raise a hand in a gesture asking for mercy. At that point, the attention of the entire arena shifted. The crowd watched closely, eager to see what decision would follow. Spectators sometimes shouted their opinions, calling for the defeated man to be spared or demanding that the victor finish the fight. The atmosphere during these moments could be electrifying. Thousands of voices filled the air, each hoping to influence the outcome. The decision itself usually rested with the organizer of the games or a presiding authority who considered both the performance of the fighters and the mood of the crowd. For the injured gladiator waiting in the sand, those seconds might feel endless. Exhausted, bleeding, and surrounded by noise, he had to wait to learn whether he would be allowed to live or ordered to die. If mercy was granted, attendants would help him leave the arena so that he could receive treatment and possibly fight again in the future. If the decision went the other way, the victor might be required to deliver a final blow while the audience watched in silence or excitement. These dramatic endings were part of what made gladiatorial combat so compelling to Roman spectators. Yet for the fighters themselves, the possibility of such a moment created enormous psychological stress. Every match ended with the understanding that the line between survival and death was extremely thin. This constant exposure to danger shaped the personalities and attitudes of many gladiators. Some developed a reputation for extraordinary bravery, standing firm even when facing powerful opponents. Others became known for clever tactics, using intelligence and agility to overcome stronger enemies. Regardless of their style, each fighter had to confront the emotional reality of living in a world where death was never far away. The arena was not just a physical battlefield but also a psychological one where determination, focus, and resilience played critical roles. Among the many stories that emerged from the gladiatorial world, one name became especially famous: Spartacus. Spartacus was originally a gladiator who had been trained in a school but eventually led one of the most dramatic revolts against Roman authority. Along with a group of fellow fighters and slaves, he escaped from captivity and began a rebellion that grew into a massive uprising. Thousands of enslaved people joined the revolt, creating a powerful force that challenged Roman armies for a time. The rebellion spread fear throughout the Roman state because it demonstrated how dangerous the gladiatorial system could become if those forced into it decided to fight back. Although the rebellion was eventually crushed by Roman forces, the story of Spartacus became legendary. It showed that even within a system designed to control and exploit fighters, the desire for freedom and dignity could still inspire resistance. However, stories like that of Spartacus were extremely rare. Most gladiators never had the opportunity or resources to attempt such a rebellion. They remained within the structure of the gladiator schools and arenas, continuing the cycle of training and combat that defined their lives. For the majority of fighters in the Roman Empire, survival meant enduring this system day after day while hoping that luck and skill would allow them to live a little longer. The psychological toll of such a life was enormous. Living with constant danger can shape a person's mind in powerful ways. Some gladiators may have developed a sense of fatalism, accepting that their fate was largely beyond their control. Others may have clung tightly to the hope of eventual freedom, believing that enough victories in the arena could one day earn them release. Friendships with fellow fighters might provide emotional support, but those relationships were complicated by the knowledge that training partners could become opponents in the arena. The tension between loyalty and survival created a complicated social environment inside gladiator schools. Despite the fear and hardship, gladiators often displayed remarkable resilience. The ability to step into the arena again and again required courage and determination. Each fight demanded concentration, physical effort, and the willingness to face danger directly. These qualities sometimes earned gladiators a strange form of respect from the Roman public. Even though they were often slaves or criminals in the eyes of the law, their bravery in the arena could inspire admiration from spectators who recognized the risks they were taking. Yet that admiration did not change the fundamental truth of their situation. Gladiators remained part of a system designed to entertain the masses through violent spectacle. The cheers of the crowd might celebrate their courage, but those same cheers also demanded more fights, more drama, and sometimes more blood. For the fighters themselves, the arena represented both the source of their fame and the place where their lives could end without warning. When the games ended and the crowds eventually left the amphitheater, the gladiators returned to the training compounds where their routines continued. Injured fighters recovered if they could, while others prepared for future matches. The noise of the arena faded into memory, replaced by the quieter but equally demanding rhythm of training and preparation. Yet the knowledge of what awaited them never disappeared. Sooner or later the gates would open again, and they would once more walk into the sand before thousands of spectators. In the end, the life of a gladiator in the world of the Roman Empire was defined by this constant cycle of preparation, combat, survival, and uncertainty. Every battle carried the possibility of victory, injury, or death. Every cheer from the crowd reminded the fighters why they were there. And every step into the arena required them to confront the most difficult reality of all: that their lives had become part of a spectacle where courage and fear existed side by side, and where the line between legend and tragedy could be crossed in a single moment beneath the bright sun and the watchful eyes of the crowd. If you enjoyed exploring what life was really like for the fighters of the ancient Roman Empire, remember that history is often very different from the stories we see in movies. The gladiators who fought in arenas across cities like Rome were not just characters in dramatic battles, they were real people living under brutal conditions, struggling to survive in a system built for entertainment and power. Behind every clash of swords and every roar of the crowd were human lives shaped by war, slavery, discipline, and extraordinary courage. Their stories remind us that the ancient world was both fascinating and harsh, filled with achievements and cruelty at the same time. If you're interested in uncovering more hidden realities of history and learning what everyday life was truly like in the past, stay curious and keep exploring the stories that shaped our world.